Hello and welcome to this video where we'll discuss the Russian threat. Because even today I regularly come across, especially on talk shows, people who claim that Russia does not represent a threat at all. I will prove to you that they are either liars or completely incompetent, because alongside the open threats we get the whole range. Subversive actions like assassination attempts, attacks, the destruction of our critical infrastructure, attacks on social cohesion or disinformation, with two very clear objectives. The first one, obviously, in a quick way, is to prevent us from continuing to support Ukraine. And in the longer term, it's to reduce our ability to defend ourselves against a future aggression. So the first word we're going to talk about is, first of all, the threat that Russia poses to its neighbors. And it started right after the end of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics against the former Eastern Bloc countries. We're well aware of the Chechen Wars, where Russia killed about a quarter of the entire population. But we often forget about the unilateral changes to borders, like in Latvia on the Narva River Islands, from which Russia refused to withdraw after independence. In 1991, or even Russia's 2003 invasion of Ukraine's Tuzla Island in the Crimean Strait, Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 was the result of their desire to use military force as a solution. This actually spanned from 1989 to 2003. As ex-Kremlin advisor Andriy Hilarionov revealed, Russia has been trying to destabilize Ukraine since its independence. In 1991, he claimed he would never attack, right up until the eve of the invasion. And that all of this was just Western propaganda and Russophobia, which made people fear an attack that would obviously never happen, since the Russians are the good guys in the story. But overall, it's all these countries from the Eastern Bloc today that are facing many direct threats, just like Georgia and Ukraine before them. For example, Putin said in June 2022 that the former Soviet countries would suffer the same fate as Ukraine if they defied Russia, including Kazakhstan, and that would happen to him if he refused to recognize the independence of the separatist regions in Ukraine, or Uzbekistan, which could suffer the same fate as Ukraine if the Russian-speaking minorities were not protected. Armenia also risked facing the same fate as Ukraine. And then there's also Kyrgyzstan, which risks suffering the same fate as Ukraine if they dare to restore the original Kyrgyz names to villages that were renamed by the Russians during the Soviet occupation. And then, more recently, it's Azerbaijan that is directly threatened with attack, because they dared to go after the Russian propaganda system that was set up in their country. The threat of "we'll do to you what we did to Ukraine" is being repeated in Central Asia and the Caucasus. So the excuse of saying it's because NATO is aggressive, no, obviously that excuse doesn't hold up, but in any case, the threats made against European countries, and therefore NATO, are real. They're even worse because we're talking about directly annexing countries. Just like the parliamentary work that was started in 2022 by Vladimir Putin's party in the Duma, and which was supposed to lead to the cancellation of the recognition of the independence of Ukraine and the Baltic states. Patrushev, Putin's top Kremlin advisor, suggests that after Ukraine's disappearance, the Baltic states would naturally return to Russian control. And this discourse is, for example, repeated by the vice president of the Duma, who is in charge of defense. Meanwhile, Russia has just changed the maritime borders of Finland and has begun building large numbers of barracks and military installations on its border. Russia maintains a separatist zone in Moldova, which it includes in its delusion of changing borders, called Novorossiya. Meanwhile, Putin considers armed conflict with NATO a possibility. Or that Defense Minister Belousov believes his army should prepare for an armed conflict with NATO in Europe. Colonel General Zawodzinsky mentions the potential for the Ukraine conflict to escalate to a European scale. Obviously, no one can believe for a second that Estonia or Lithuania pose a threat to Russia, or that Finland is obviously going to try to annex Russia. So, the future conflict would obviously be provoked by Russia. Despite discussing aggression, some people insist there are no aggressive statements being made. Annexation, reintegration of countries from former Russian colonies to bring them back into Russia? We're discussing direct, overt military actions against NATO and Europe. And it's worth noting the repeated threats to use nuclear weapons, which started well before 2022. And you can see a non-exhaustive list of these so-called nuclear intimidation attempts. But while waiting to take military action, well, Russia is already trying to harm and destabilize us. It's specifically to reduce our ability to support Ukraine and defend ourselves. The list is extremely long, but we can already talk about the organization of attacks on our soil with many proven incidents. For example, in Paris, when a Russian agent who was preparing an attack against a shopping center in the north of Paris, just before the Olympic Games, fortunately or unfortunately for him, set off his explosive device in his hotel room before carrying out the act, which allowed him to be identified. We can also note the May 2024 attack on the Warsaw shopping center, for which 9 perpetrators have been arrested. Lithuania has officially attributed the attack on the IKEA store in Vilnius to Russian services. You have probably also heard about the parcel bombs that were sent by Russian services to set planes on fire. Fortunately, in both cases, it was a failure because the delivery schedules were not respected by the service providers. First, we have a container in which a parcel that had just exploded caught fire while it was about to be loaded onto a plane. In Leipzig, Germany, in July 2024, and it's the same thing for a package that was sent by plane to Birmingham. And we can also mention the numerous cases, like for example the fire at this warehouse in London for which 6 suspects linked to the Wagner company were arrested. But we can also point out that Russia is officially and openly collaborating with terrorists, for example, with tools by directly providing intelligence so they can target our cargo ships. And we can also mention the attacks organized by Moscow against our military infrastructure or support for Ukraine, like the destruction of German army trucks, with footage first appearing on Russian Telegram channels. We can also mention the attack on a British army plane by a group of defenders of Palestine, but who are actually funded and manipulated by a wealthy American who supports Russia and has even traveled several times to the occupied areas of Ukraine. Or the explosion at the British Aerospace Systems factory in Wales on April 15th, which was also attributed to Russia, or by directly targeting the military, like the 2 Russian agents who were arrested in Bavaria while they were preparing bomb attacks and arson against military targets, and the American base in Grafenwoehr, or the attempted contamination of the tap water at the Bundeswehr base in Köln-Wann and then at the NATO base in Geilenkirchen. There were also the fires in Poland targeting the MESCO arms factories, as well as attacks on railway terminals coordinated by Russia. And we can also mention the sabotage that caused train derailments in Sweden, as well as the fires in ammunition factories in Bulgaria, and the murder of the head of production. Not to mention the assassination attempts that were foiled in Germany against the president of the Rheinmetall company. But well, in the end, the attacks, the organization of assassinations, the sabotage, all that, it's still not aggression against us, is it? And besides these direct open attacks against our military capability, Russia is also targeting strategic infrastructure. Similar to the 11 undersea cables in the Baltic destroyed in 15 months, which investigations by 6 affected European nations are attributing to Russia. There are also power cables, like in December 2024, when a Russian oil tanker dragged its anchor along the seabed and cut the S-Link 2 power cable between the end of Orleans, Estonia, or even the destruction of gas pipelines like the Baltic Corridor in the same area in October 2023. Cyber operations can also be discussed. We'll disregard the disinformation mentioned to me in another video, as well as the hacking attempts on satellite terminals. Incidents of impersonation or jamming of communication systems, particularly French ones, have occurred by airing violent content in place of children's shows. This also includes the jamming of global positioning systems used by commercial airplanes. This affects tens of thousands of airplanes and puts the people on board at risk. Russia is violating freedom of navigation by firing at military aircraft in international airspace, which should be open and accessible. Like the firing of a missile in the Black Sea at a British reconnaissance, 135 warning shots at a German helicopter in the Baltic Sea, and radar targeting of an Atlantique, 2 Frenchmen. Or the destruction of drones with those dangerous maneuvers, or the intimidation against a French drone in the Mediterranean as well. It's a bit like if France were to fire at or attack Russian ships passing through the English Channel, even though it's the French exclusive economic zone. We let them pass, but on their side they're trying to prevent us from passing through areas that are legally accessible to any aircraft anywhere in the world. By the way, let's not forget that Russia regularly violates the airspace of European and NATO countries. Just like this Sukhoi 35 that entered Estonian airspace last May. Or like the 2 strategic bombers accompanied by 2 fighters that entered Finnish airspace a year ago. And we could also mention Poland, Sweden or Germany. Missiles have also landed around Ukraine, such as in Romania. So Russia is really playing with fire. A small spark could escalate the situation, but they are still the ones provoking these events. And it would make sense that if a French European plane violated Russian airspace, what would happen? They would defend themselves by shooting it down, which would be legitimate. And we just stand by and watch, doing nothing, and that allows them to go even further, and by adding 1%, 1%, 1% each time. We've reached a level that's unacceptable, but the fact is we're still not reacting today. And so the worst part is that besides these attacks, which by the way, we don't even allow ourselves to call or label as attacks, today they've already been trying to weaken our societies for years and years. That means they're stirring up social tensions and supporting groups that are opposed. And here we could have hundreds of examples, like in the United States, where the Black Lives Matter movement was directly funded by Russia, or in France, the Traoré Family Association, which was supported by Prigozhin. In France, we can also highlight the systematic organization of anti-Semitic acts, a tactic Russia has employed for over a century, with the blue star of David graffiti. At the end of 2023, the red hands spray-painted on the walls of the righteous at the Shoah Memorial in May 2024. The thinly disguised threat during the Olympics, recalling the Munich Olympic attacks. Last month, the Holocaust Memorial was vandalized with green paint. Each time there were proven links with the Federal Security Service to create tensions. We can also point out the encouragement of drug trafficking to Europe by mafia groups that are coordinated by Russia. And on this subject, I invite you to consult the report on the use of mafia networks, specifically by Russia. And we can also mention the direct organization of immigration to Europe to use it as a weapon against our societies, whether it's the chartering of Iraqi flights to Poland or Syrians or Somalis being escorted by Russian border guards to the Finnish border, or the organization of migrant crossings in the Mediterranean directly by the Wagner militia from Libya. And by the way, there's an unusually high proportion of Russian captains serving as commanders of boats transporting migrants across the Mediterranean. For example, there are these 14 Russian nationals who were arrested in Italy as skippers of migrant boats. So Russia is directly manipulating public opinion on these topics in order to encourage people from those African countries where they've managed to install coup governments to leave. And they've even had local laws changed to make immigration to Europe easier. For example, in Niger. So the goal here is simple. Russia is trying to increase immigration. And then you have reports from the Ministry of the Armed Forces, or Vigilium, that describe Russian interference campaigns aimed at creating identity divisions. That is to say, all of this is meant to weaken our countries, while allowing political parties more favorable to Russia to come to power. This identity division is also used to fragment countries like France, for example, by supporting separatists. Kana, what led to the riots in New Caledonia, and we see a similar phenomenon in Guyana, for example. Or when Russian media, like Russia Today, officially and openly supported independence, Catalonia, Spain, Flanders, Belgium, Lombardy, Italy, Corsica, France. This also leads the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Intérieure to highlight Russia's intention to divide French society. So, I could have continued this list and with very concrete facts for a long time. I still hope that you now understand why. An increasing number of intelligence services are saying that if we don't allow Ukraine to hold on, and if we don't rearm ourselves, not very quickly, and quite frankly, Russia could launch an open direct attack against Europe and against NATO within 2 to 3 years. So we really all need to be aware that without a massive and rapid effort, we're heading toward a war, the cost of which will obviously be infinitely higher than the investments needed today to support Ukraine. And so we need a policy of French and European power. We need to produce equipment on a large scale so that Ukraine can benefit from it right away, but also so that our industry is ready. If, unfortunately, it becomes necessary in a few years, above all, we must stop turning a blind eye to the Russian threat. We need to support Sky Shield to protect Ukrainians today, and we need to stop preventing ourselves from calling these threats and attacks what they really are. These are attacks, and they are getting bigger and bigger. Precisely because we don't dare to use the right words and act according to the level of the threat. When he violates a treaty, we on our side need to restore some form of symmetry, otherwise it's always them who escalate. And that absolutely has to come to an end. We have to say stop. Did you enjoy this video? Thanks to Sebastian for supporting me in writing this text. I will also include links to the think tank where he works. And also, you see, there are a lot of links because everything I mentioned, all the examples in this video, you'll find all the links. If you want to go through reading dozens and dozens of reports, it'll take you a few days in my opinion. See you soon. Have a great summer.